This is Faux-Authentic History.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Brian Young.
And Brian, you have probably heard of Tinkerbell.
Indeed, who hasn't heard of Tinkerbell?
There's probably somebody. But what listeners may not realize is that the Tinker portion of her name is actually a reference to her talent guild. So she was often referred to by her Tinker colleagues as Miss Bell. And she, and many other fairies like her, were tasked with keeping the mechanical aspects of fairy culture running and for creating life's necessities. So Tinker fairies were, above all, the makers of any fairy society.
And just to be clear, there have been so many different types of fairies throughout history, but today we're only talking about a very benign and generally helpful variety found primarily in Western Europe, specifically in the British Isles.
But again, to be very clear, their home was in a sort of alternate space from the one that we humans inhabit, although they could, and in fact had to, pass from one realm, their own, to the other, the human world. And while the fairies were responsible for the changes of seasons in the human world, their own home sat in a sort of stasis where all of the seasons kind of existed simultaneously, though separately, i.e. there was an autumnal area and a winter area, etc. And they would pull resources from each of these areas as needed to see to the ongoing task of keeping the seasons in the human world on schedule.
On occasions when fairies would visit what they called the mainland, which would be the human world, they had to stay carefully tucked away to avoid being seen. And in these cases, they would set up camps, usually inside large hollow trees with enough space to house all their needs, and the Tinkers would provide these camps with all the necessities.
And while there was some encyclopedic-style scholarship within the fairy culture on their own history, much of that is unfortunately lost. And while we do have some translations, they are, at best, only partial texts.
And one of the main references we have about Tinker fairies and other talent guilds comes from the writings of Wendy Darling, who was able to actually visit Pixie Hollow and observe the lives and activities of the fairies living there firsthand.
And while it remains unclear because of the sort of big gaps in the historical texts that the fairies themselves created, how far back on the timeline this particular fairy species existed, we do know that they were really, really active in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And their current status is actually unknown, and we're going to talk about that and some debate surrounding it towards the end of the episode.
So, but to talk about the history of Tinkers, we first have to cover some basics about general fairy life, so you have the context of how Tinkers, as well as other types of fairies, fit into that life in a surprisingly organized way.
This gets really, really fascinating to me. So the way fairies of this variety were traditionally born, and I'm putting the air quotes around the word born, was through a really unique mechanism. It was actually the laughter of infants. So the first time a baby laughed, the energy of that laughter would then attach to a drifting object, like a natural object, such as a seed pod.
So the laughter-infused drifting material, it would then float away. It would float its way toward a fairy civilization, aided and ushered along the way by fast-flying fairies who manipulated wind currents around it to ensure it landed in exactly the right spot. Then, a dust keeper fairy would sprinkle it with pixie dust.
We're going to talk a little bit more about those two kinds of fairies in just a moment. But this pixie dust catalyzed a nearly instant transformation, though the actual science behind it still eludes modern researchers and historians. But from the seed pod or other conveyance, a full pixie would sort of bloom, adult, conscious, and able to communicate. And the material from which they emerged would then form this sort of transitional garment, so modesty was always maintained.
While the fairy emerged in its adult form, there was a certain degree of confusion and naivete initially as the newborn sentient acclimated to existing in a structured society with expectations and rules.
And normally, fairy royalty would be in attendance at the arrival of any new fairy. So through the advanced skill and wisdom of the royal leader, the fairy's wings would be activated, and the new pixie would be guided through his or her first experiments at flight by the king or queen whose dominion they had joined. And this entire ceremony was very joyous. It was both gentle and exuberant, but above all else, it was treated with care and great gravity.
The next step for a new fairy was discovering his or her talent. Icons would be brought into the circle where all of this ceremony had been taking place, and these icons represented the various fairy talent guilds, including the flower fairies, frost fairies, water, light, fast flying fairies, animal fairies, and of course, tinker fairies.
So we're going to do a brief breakdown on some of the most common fairy types and their associated jobs, and we'll start with fast-flying fairies. These were responsible for creating wind and, to some degree, weather, and they used their speed to create everything from light and gentle breezes to full-on tornadoes.
Flower fairies planted seeds, helped flowers grow, ensured that flowers had proper coloring, and generally saw to any plant life that needed tending.
Light fairies manipulated light, as you may imagine, in all sorts of ways. So sometimes this meant bending light to assure it illuminated plants, but it could also be used to create light sources for fairies in need of it. Light fairies could also create rainbows, and this was often done in a cooperative effort with water fairies.
Water fairies, as the name implies, were masters of H2O. They could transform water into various shapes, send bubble messages, and create fountains.
Frost fairies worked with ice crystals to create snowflakes and ice formations, and they also aided the transition into winter from any of the warmer seasons by making sure that frost coated plants and kept them safe.
Animal fairies were able to communicate with any animal. They could soothe anxious animals, aid sick animals, even help animals make transitions, such as assisting fledgling birds in flight.
And dust talent fairies were rarer than many other types, and they were experts in pixie dust. They were the keepers of the dust, which was rationed out to all other fairies. This was basically the most vital job in any fairy community, as none of the other fairies could do their jobs without the aid of pixie dust. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment.
So when the newborn fairy approached the icon, often an orb or a simple object which represented his or her true talent, the icon would glow, and in cases of a fairy with a truly rare level of talent, sometimes it would release a burst of pixie dust. And once the fairy's talent had revealed itself, it would determine that fairy's job and cast for life.
And this idea of a fate-driven social structure may seem really, really alien and even potentially offensive to the modern ear. To most humans, particularly in the free world, the idea of having no say in your life's vocation may seem to be misery, bordering on some sort of serfdom. But this is one of those cultural differences that might be really hard to fully grasp.
To fairy culture, this idea of a predestined talent was the norm, and for the most part, it seemed to create a happy and harmonious society because it correctly identified the natural proclivity of each fairy. No one had to muddle through their early adulthood figuring out what they wanted to do with their lives, which, maybe humans can learn something from that.
I know myself, I have done it, and many other people do. You waste a little bit of time trying to figure out your path in life, and this seemed to have worked 100% of the time.
Yeah, that's a pretty good batting average.
Yeah. So while there were occasional issues of class superiority among the fairies, I'm sure people listening are wondering, these issues really were very isolated. On occasion, tinker fairies, due to the sometimes menial nature of their work, were looked down on by other talents, particularly fast-flying fairies. But in truth, if you actually step back and look at the data, this usually had more to do with individual fairies rather than there being any larger systemic clashes between the various talent guilds.
There's only one recorded instance of a fairy bucking against their inherent talent guild and attempting to become a different type of fairy, and that was Tinker Bell. Eventually, though, she realized that, in fact, tinkering was something she loved to do. She was more hung up about the opportunities other fairies were offered, particularly traveling from Pixie Hollow to the mainland where humans lived to usher in changes of seasons, than she was with her actual tasks. And eventually, the rules shifted, and she was able to travel with her fairy friends to the places where humans dwell, and she went on to be one of the most prolific and respected tinkers of all time.
And this entire process of fairy birth and talent reveal is shown quite clearly in the first Tinkerbell documentary. It's really quite fascinating if you're interested in it. And now we're going to talk a lot more about tinker talents specifically and some of the really amazing inventions that they were able to concoct. But before that, Brian, do you want to pause and have a little break?
Nothing would delight me more.
Spectacular.
So this is the part of the show where there would be advertisements for things, but the show is new, and so we do not have advertisements for things yet. If you are interested in advertising on Authentic History, you can email me at brian@bigshinyrobot.com, and we can get that squared away. But in the meantime, you have an extra short break. Let's get back to the show.
So back to the show, we're going to talk about tinker talents. And for fairies whose talent turned out to be tinkering, their jobs were largely along the lines of serving the material needs of other fairies. As the name indicates, they had a natural proclivity for tinkering.
And tinker neighborhoods were often somewhat plain in comparison to other fairy guilds. So if you think about flower fairies like living among the flowers, it's probably really pretty, but the tinkers had to keep things a little less fancy, and this was necessitated largely by the need to live near their various workshops and supply lines.
One of the first things a new tinker talent would do was settle into his or her new home. Almost any time a fairy village was alerted to the imminent arrival of a new member of their community, each talent guild prepared a basic domicile just in case the new addition was revealed to be one of them.
And in the case of a tinker, the residence was outfitted usually with just the basics, because the inclination to create things also meant that most tinkers liked to set up their own spaces. And to some degree, this early stage of makerism, setting up the household, served as a sort of training for life as a productive tinker. Because keep in mind, these are creatures that have only come to life in the immediate past.
It's sort of like a foal, like immediately dropping out of a mother horse and needing to walk instantly.
Right.
But then it's also like, okay, you've got one lap and then you're going to run a race.
It kind of is exactly like that.
So, which is to say that there wasn't really a lot of time to linger in the training phase, because tinkers were depended upon to keep all of the other fairy guilds supplied with anything they may have needed to complete their jobs. New tinkers were quickly assigned any number of projects right out of the gate. Tasks could be as simple as creating teapots and other kitchenwares. Most fairies were extremely fond of chamomile tea in particular, or as large in scale as machinery to assist with planting seeds or wrangling animals.
Now, they weren't just thrown to the wolves with these new jobs, though. There was a senior fairy that was in charge of supervising the various projects, both for quality control and to ensure that the builds were happening on schedule and that deliveries went out on time. And this fairy would also ensure that any new tinkers would benefit from the collective wisdom of the group, and that fairies who were struggling with their workloads received the necessary training and assistance to excel.
And tinkers weren't only bound to the work they were assigned, however. Many tinker fairies took advantage of particularly important times of year, the production of spring, for example, to show the fairy leadership their ingenuity.
And based on archaeological finds and the writings of Miss Darling, we know that tinkers could be incredibly creative and build truly astonishing devices. Many of them were created with items that had once been used by humans but were then lost or discarded. So here's a sampling of a few pieces that evidence the incredible ingenuity that tinkers applied to their work.
So first, a tiny device made using an acorn shell reservoir and a series of tiny hollow twigs was used for painting ladybugs in a two-step process. It first applied an even coat of organic red pigment, then shot tiny black dots through the twig tubes to create spots.
Another item was made with a combination of an airtight human glove and an old-fashioned perfume spritzer. So seeds were loaded into each of the glove's fingers, which had these minute holes cut into the tips, and the bellows of the spritzer was affixed to the thumb of the glove. So with one squeeze of the bellows, numerous seeds could be spread at one time to maximize efficiency.
A rudimentary paint manufacturer system was unearthed that evidenced a basic hand-powered pressing mechanism that extracted natural pigment from berries.
And remember earlier when we referenced fairy camps in trees? Some inventions appear to have been built expressly for expediting mainland transitional practices, so that fairies could do some of their work in situ rather than having to make and build everything and prepare all of the animals and bugs in their home and then transport it to the human world.
And these mainland found items include looms, which appear to have been used to create especially delicate flowers, such as Queen Anne's lace, and spinning pigment brushes, which are believed to have been used to add striping to insect abdomens. I'm glad that those flowers were Queen Anne's lace and not Queen Anne's revenge.
But there are some really impressive artifacts that kind of outstrip the ones we've already talked about that indicate that the Tinkers experimented with some really sophisticated projects along the lines of automated vehicles. One, which resembles a rudimentary paddle boat, was constructed using a hollowed-out gourd that formed both the hull and the interior of the gourd formed the passenger area, as well as a series of spliced-together playing cards that created the rear paddle wheel and pieces of nutshells that were arranged into additional cupping wheels to create additional thrust on the sides of the craft.
Oh, that's just crazy to me. Like, they're geniuses.
So ingenious.
So there's evidence even of rubber residue suggesting that a rubber band may have been implemented as part of that drive mechanism. So like it gets even weirder, like and more stupendous. So it appears that the twigs had been shaped into ski-like shapes under the craft, hinting that it might have been able to lift out of the water.
It's so cool. And there are also some indications that some fairies may have traveled by balloon, or more accurately, a balloon-like structure. As with the watercraft that we just described, a hollowed-out gourd formed the passenger basket, and numerous pieces of twine interlaced to form a sort of netting structure that could hold material such as dandelion fluff that could easily be picked up by the breeze.
So one of the most important tasks a fairy could be assigned was the creation of the fall scepter for the Great Autumn Revelry and Blue Harvest Moon. This didn't always fall to Tinker talents. It rotated among the talent guilds. The scepter made use of a precious blue moonstone, which when hit by the light of the blue moon created blue pixie dust, vital to keep the pixie dust tree thriving and fairy culture along with it.
And the import of the blue moon and the functioning of this scepter really cannot be overstated. Blue moons only happened once every 8 years, according to fairy lore, and the light beam's trajectory had to match the moonstone's curvature at a 90-degree angle in order for the transmutation of light into pixie dust to happen. And this whole design had to be perfectly executed.
During one of the Tinker-led builds of the scepter, the moonstone was broken into multiple pieces and each was mounted separately. And this massive shift in design resulted in an abundance of blue pixie dust, unlike ever seen prior during the Autumn Blue Moon Festival. And I've got a question for you, Holly.
Yeah.
Was that on purpose? Did they break it into multiple pieces on purpose, or did they like accidentally break it and then redesign it so it actually became better?
It was an accident.
I figured. But that just speaks to the ingenuity of the Tinkers.
Exactly. And there was a dust fairy also involved in that redesign, so they have to get a little credit too.
Okay.
And now I want to talk a little bit about the reality of Tinkers and other fairies, because if you, listener, know anything about lunar phases as we humans track them, you probably red flagged back there when we mentioned the blue moon being an event that took place every 8 years. So a blue moon in human parlance indicates an extra moon in a calendar year, so 13 instead of 12. That means that some month in the year will have 2 full moons instead of 1. And this happens because the lunar cycle doesn't match exactly to our calendar. So every 2 to 3 years, there is an extra full moon in the mix.
So all of this is important when examining what we know of pixie culture. Now, there's obviously a disconnect between the astronomical happenings in places like Pixie Hollow and those of the world we know. Some historians would argue that this is a clear indicator that fairy happenings, and perhaps their entire existence, are largely, or perhaps entirely, fabricated. But others make the case that this is more of a clear signal of the separate and perhaps even magical nature of the dimension in which fairies are able to exist, even as it so closely overlaps our own.
Yeah, there are also some arguments that go on about just the fairy calendar existing differently, since their seasons all exist in a state of simultaneity, but we just don't know. And one of the other and more sentimental functions of Tinkers that kind of informs this discussion was the repair and return of so-called lost things. That's what fairies called them. And those were items that humans had misplaced or given up due to having non-functioning parts. So if you have ever had a mechanical item, like a watch that had stuck hands, or a keepsake box with a broken latch, any number of, small mechanical things that didn't work, and then you find after a period of not thinking about that item, or, you stumble back across it after it's been shoved in a drawer or something for a while, that suddenly it works again, that is exactly the kind of thing that Tinker fairies would have historically had a hand in.
That's why we all have junk drawers.
Correct. So the fairies can fix stuff.
And this brings up a debate that continues among historians and fairy enthusiasts. While there is a very strong opinion among many that if fairies did indeed exist, they're long gone. There are some who still believe that they are doing their work around us all the time, though, which is why I have a fully stocked junk drawer.
And on the side of the doubters in this debate is the evidence, or rather the lack thereof. So we have no photographs or live capture fairies. And certainly in our advanced technological age, it would seem that such a nature-based society would really struggle to keep up. And additionally, the case could be made that post-industrial economies create environments that would be incredibly hazardous and likely poisonous to such small, delicate creatures.
I think that's one of the most fascinating reasons that I really love that Tinkerbell documentary so much, is that in the absence of all that evidence, they actually they did the entire documentary in what is essentially artist's rendition. Yeah,
it's really amazing. And again, that's thanks largely to what records we have and the work that Wendy Darling did to document her time at Pixie Hollow.
So to talk about the other side of the coin, though, is the fact that we do still experience seasons, and sometimes we do find once broken objects that suddenly work with no real explanation. There's been discussion of the possibility that Fairy Society never actually ushered in the seasons, but instead perhaps was doing their work concurrently with it, so there was a false sense of causality. But some texts, though rudimentary in nature, have also been discovered that indicate that fairies falsely planted the idea of seasons being the result of the Earth's axis tilting towards and away from the sun as it makes its annual orbit.
Right, that's probably what you learned in school, but it is possible that fairies planted that knowledge, and which would really be groundbreaking, because it would mean that our knowledge of the cosmos and the universe is based on a fictional seed in some ways. So if that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what will.
It did.
And so while we may never really know for certain just what level of impact fairies, and particularly tinkers, have had on human civilization, it's certain that they were vital and perhaps most important of all the talent guilds to at least keeping their own society functioning.
I'm really glad that I learned about this. When you said you wanted to do this episode, I was like, well, I'm going to learn a lot. And it turned out delightfully, I think.
I've been studying fairy texts for a long time, so it seemed like a natural fit.
I would have never guessed that would have been one of your specialties, to be honest. Yeah, you seem more... at least these sorts of fairies. I would have guessed some fairies from other regions that are a little bit darker.
Yeah, no, there's I have a love of pixie dust. I mean, who doesn't? Who wouldn't love a little pixie dust to, help do things better, faster, with more zazz and pizzazz?
I would love that. I mean, I'd need faith, trust, and pixie dust. That's it.
Yeah, and then you're set.
Yeah. Okay. Again, this is our first batch of recording the show, so we don't have any listener mail. So that's that.
Yeah.
For this one, thank you so much for bringing this really fascinating debate to our attention.
Thank you so much for participating in it with me, Brian. So fun.
It was my pleasure.
Yay!